always been fascinated by what, um, why people act in ways that are against their interests and
Hmm.
why they will support people who are insulting them and promising to do things that are not in the interests of society, and yet they have success.
Well, do the people feel like they're the ones being insulted?
No, they actually often feel they're being taken care of because many authoritarians are very skilled at the media. They're
Hmm.
very skilled at connecting with people, and they pose as saviors. They also pose as mavericks. And so breaking the rules is in the interest of serving the people and correcting injustices that have happened to the culture. So they often talk about victimhood of the nation and how they're going to fix it.
Well, it's
And this,
interesting because I feel like there's also this push against victimhood in strongman culture, right? Like there's a certain class of victim that's acceptable and a certain class that isn't.
yeah, so authoritarianism is a lot about propaganda and noise, right? They want to be flooding our TV screens and our social media feeds, but they also silence. They depend on silence. They disappear people, they disappear fields of knowledge that are not in line with their goals. So their leaders, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's banned gender studies.
Hmm.
In Russia, Vladimir Putin doesn't let you speak about certain historical facts, like the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. So the um, silence is just as important as noise in propaganda.
And are strongmen always using propaganda as a tool? Like, what is the definition of propaganda? I guess we can start there.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And literally, from Italian, which comes from the Latin, propagare is to diffuse or to spread,
Hmm.
to propagate. So it's a neutral term. And one of the first institutions to have a propaganda office was the Vatican.
Hmm.
Wow.
And you see how that goes with spreading the mission of converting souls for Catholicism, right? So propagate comes from that. And then in the 20th century, it became associated with more negative um, ends. So with disinformation, with fooling people, with telling people lies and having them accept it as reality.
And where did this start happen? Was this in Germany, or I know you studied Italy a lot.
Yeah, so Mussolini was the well in the 1920s it was Italian fascists with Mussolini and also early communism with Lenin and Stalin, and they kind of traced the two paths, the right and the left, that far right and far left, that propaganda would take. But some of the mechanisms are often the same, um, and so uh, you want to attack people's capacity for critical thinking, and so many authoritarian regimes either ban certain kinds of science and scientific thinking, or they promote certain kinds and fields of science like that fit their ideologies, like racial science,
Hmm.
Wow.
right? But you want to get people to believe that what you say is the truth, and that you want to also clear the space of those like from lawyers to journalists who have the capacity to harm you by exposing the truth.
I want to go back to what you just said about science. It's really interesting. obviously are studying humans, and it's interesting that science can become weaponized. Is this a unique thing to fascism, or do you see this on the left as well? I notice you in general choose to focus on the right in your work, at least in your latest book. And is this a universal aspect that the interpretation of science can be weaponized?
It's universal. In my book, I focus on the right because I've always studied fascism, and I want to show the through lines between the fascists and post-war right-wing military coups up to people in office today who are connected to that. Like Bolsonaro goes back to he likes to hearken back to the right-wing military coup that Brazil had. They had a military dictatorship. Or in America, Trump, who valorized, neo-Nazis, right? And all the right-wing extremists. So that's why I do that. But it is very much universal of anti-democratic, anti-pluralist states. And so science is highly threatening because of the scientific method of objectivity, the whole notion of evidence. And so just as we talk about silence and noise with propaganda, with science, you have certain fields of science have always been very interesting to dictators to take over and colonize, such as statistics and social science and hard science, let's say.
Well,
so that's or demographics. They're very always interested for 100 years in demographics. So anything to do with biology, with fertility is going to be weaponized by authoritarians.
Why are they so interested in statistics? It seems like a dry discipline for a strongman.
It does. So, and this started in Mussolini's Italy as well as early communism, because productivity, if you can only uphold the myth of the efficiency of authoritarians and get people to buy into your project, meaning business elites, foreign lenders, if you produce the right statistics about your economy's growth, about the scientific discoveries you're making, and to do that, you have to have the right people in place in your statistics agency. So one of the first, so Italy's National Statistics Agency, which is known by the acronym ISTAT, was founded by Mussolini in the late 1920s as an aid to, being able to boast that they were having the biggest wheat harvest, that they were discovering new crops, that they were making the trains run on time. And here are the statistics to show it.
So it's almost like in science, it's not just about providing evidence, but it's like, which evidence are you going to point to? And which evidence is important in the context of your conclusions?
Yeah, and it goes down to personnel, and it goes down to authoritarians who always target the civil service and always target universities, researchers, because those are the people who are going to be complicit in your doctored statistics, in your false science, in your making arguments that certain kinds of female bodies and not others should be held up because if you have wider hips, you're more fertile, which is what the fascists said. All of these demographic, the science around demography, and that's a through line from Mussolini up to Orban in Hungary today, for example, and Poland, and in Russia. So these are processes that go over a century, and there's remarkable similarities in the both from propaganda point of view and from the rank and file of scientists, what happens to demography and anything to do with natural resources. Today it's climate change denialism. There are certain through lines in fields that autocrats always attack.
That's a really interesting point because it seems like when there is fear of authoritarianism, then there is a conflict within science as well, because there are some things that come to the surface as consensus, and then when, such as, let's say, climate change, and if a strongman was to attack that, then the scientific community would be faced with a huge conundrum. They would have to galvanize around some consensus, and it would create a situation where that consensus couldn't shift, because shifting it would play into the hands of politics that they found repugnant.
Yeah, that's well said. And in America, you had the March for Science very soon after Trump was inaugurated, because people recognized very clearly what the stakes were. It depends on, in a country, how much of the science is private and how much, many times, big grants and important science is done with state funding, and this leaves scientists vulnerable to the politicization of the field. And the dynamics in authoritarian states, even in democracies that are in decline, are that professionalism is valued less than loyalty. So you have a changing of the guard, you have a purge, and it happened in America under Trump at the Environmental Protection Agency. It happened at the Center for Disease Control. If we go across the board of all of the federal agencies that use scientists and social science, we haven't yet fully reckoned with the scale of the changeover and how many people were forced out or made to work in hostile environments, so they would resign, they would self-remove.
So I have a question. You are very much interested in this recent president of the United States, but he seems kind of like a diet version of a lot of these authoritarians that you've talked about in your book. Is it just that it's surprising that this kind of thing could happen in America?
Well,
or do you think that Trump could actually have led to something approximating Mussolini or Pinochet?
Was he going to start pushing people out of helicopters?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book is to show how authoritarianism evolves over a century. That today you don't have as many one-party states. You have China, you have communist, one-party dictatorships like in North Korea, but in general, the age of military coups is over, not totally as we saw in Myanmar, but today you come to power through elections, and you have to manipulate elections to stay there. The other thing is, due to social media and having to get elected, there's a little bit less public mass violence. Now, Duterte in the Philippines, he has said how happy he was to push somebody out of a helicopter years ago, and he'd do it again. But in practice, this kind of public state torture activities are not practiced at home as much. Nowadays, you warehouse your enemies in mass detention. Putin poisons high-profile or assassinates high-profile individuals, but on a mass level, he puts people in penal colonies. Erdogan has arrested over 100,000 people, and they're in jails. So the helicopters, there's a lot of longing for that, and that's if you look at in the United States, the Proud Boys, a far-right extremist group, they wear T-shirts that say Pinochet did nothing wrong, referring to the Chilean dictator who pushed people out of helicopters.
Really?
Yeah, and you can buy on Amazon.com, a big commerce site. You can buy T-shirts that talk about helicopter rides for leftists. So
no thanks.
Myth is still there. Well, it's not a myth. The longing, the veneration of this violence is still there, but in practice, it would be harder to pull off today.
So the game has changed a little bit.
The game has changed. And so I wanted, though, people to not have the danger is that people say, well, um, someone today isn't acting like Hitler or Mussolini, and so that means that there's no threat, or people say, well, you're talking and you're not in jail and you're a critic, but that's not how it works today. So I wanted, in writing this book, Strongmen, to educate people in how it does work today and what has changed and what stays the same.
So who is benefiting from these strongmen? Somebody has to benefit more than just the strongman, right?
Sure. Well, they make their bargains with elites. They are often propped up by religious institutions. And this can go very well with the discarding of scientific objectivity for faith-based or on issues that religious groups, certain kinds of religious groups, fear secularization. They prefer faith-centered policy making around reproductive rights, for example. And this goes on in many countries in the world today. So religious institutions can benefit. Big capital often benefits. And if they're denying climate change, it means that fossil fuels can benefit people who are in mining, logging, and you see what has gone on in Brazil under Bolsonaro with the Amazon. So there are plenty of people who benefit. And then there are the people who are persuaded by propaganda, the grassroots, who think they are benefiting. And they only find out later on, when the country is gone into ruin over, for example, a mismanaged pandemic, that the leader did not have their best interests at heart. They just didn't know.
This is the really interesting group. So it makes sense that strong leaders would be able to recruit elites to their causes, but how do you get people to vote against their own interests?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. Part of it, it's like a puzzle. One piece of the puzzle is the leader cult, where people bond to the leader. He asks for their loyalty. He promises to be the savior. He promises to fix things for them. He tells them how bad everything is, how disrespected their country is, how humiliated they are, how disaster is going to befall them. So he gets their loyalty early on, and once this bond of loyalty and faith is consolidated, and if it's maintained through propaganda, and you're able to influence the media to just say what is beneficial to the leader, the bond is not broken despite evidence to the contrary. And in old-fashioned dictatorships like Hitler and Mussolini, it took being bombed by the Allies for the leader cult to start to really disintegrate. So that's part of it. And another thing is that we often focus on how authoritarians are violent and destructive, but they also are very skilled at telling people they love them, making the included. So the excluded have the fates we know, but the included are told that they are special, that they are the future of the nation, that they're in a partnership with the leader. And this is where the media skill of these leaders comes in. They know how to connect with people. President Trump, former President Trump, used to very often say that he loved his followers. Even when he did a rally right before the January 6th attack on the Capitol, he told them, "I love you, you're special, and our journey together has just begun."
Wow.
So they think they are serving themselves. They feel that they have been elevated by him, and so it's not just about bashing other people's heads in. It's not just about enemies. It's also about feeling loved.
So it's almost like this father figure. It reminds me of this. It's interesting you put it in the frame of a cult, and that it almost seems like this God King motif that goes way back into antiquity. Do you think that there's some sort of ancient piece of the human psychology that requires this sort of figure?
I think there is and a component of personality cults that touches on earlier ages is the idea that the leader's body is special, that he has. It used in early modern times, kings used to be they were reputed to have the healing touch, so that commoners would come and be healed as though they were like a preacher with one of the religions that you had holy men who could heal just by their touch or just by proximity to their figure. And some of this has remained in 21st century personality cults, which is a very, very interesting thing. So there are human needs to venerate someone. And indeed, the modern authoritarian came up at a time after World War I where many people had a crisis of faith. And the old leaders, the kings, and World War I swept away 4 empires. And there was like a crisis of authority.
Which empires were those?
The Ottoman, the Russian, the Habsburg Empire, and I'm forgetting the other one.
So people were kind of tired of this old motif anyways. They were sort of ready for something.
Well, some people were ready for something, but in others who didn't expect this World War I was a huge mass trauma, and it left people with a hunger for certainties, and but also people who could make them feel better about this new age. There was a lot of, especially men who had come out of the war dismembered, and their male authority was seen as in crisis. And so these strong men, exactly, came up and had a lot of success.
Well, there's also the fact that human rights were expanding at this time, right? And so you have a world where the idea of women's rights or the rights of other races except for white races is being considered for the very first time. And so, because you place the birth of authoritarianism in the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
And so for it to be in the 1920s means that it was born out of all of these social changes that happened right around World War I. And at least some of that must have to do with the expansion of rights to be more than just one class of people, right? The same ones that are coming back from the war.
And this is a recurring theme that these leaders find favor whenever their country has gone through a lot of rapid social progress, where it could be gender emancipation, like even when there's a military coup, you still see that an appetite builds. So in Spain in the 1930s, women got huge amounts of rights and legal independence for the first time, and this was very threatening to some people. It could be secularization. It could be advances for indigenous people, racial emancipation. Like in America, you had 8 years of the presidency of Barack Obama, and some people thought he should never have had the right to be president in the first place. So it's after this kind of rapid change, and under Obama, you had legalization of same-sex marriage, you had gender integration of the military. All of this adds up to situations that make some people feel very anxious and angry, and so somebody comes up who is openly reactionary, wanting to turn things back, openly macho, openly racist. And these, over and over again in history, these are the times that these figures have success.
So that would suggest that people aren't necessarily voting against their own interests. They're voting very much for their own interests, and their interests happen to be very fundamental and regressive in some way.
Yes. It's later because once these figures get power, And consolidating power takes a while. It takes in America, Trump didn't have time. Had he had a second term, it would have we would have lost a lot more freedoms. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But it's only later when they bring about destruction that people realize that they were voting against their interests. In the beginning, they think they're voting for refreshing change.
Do you think that people are reacting to a sense of emasculation, or they're losing their sense of strength and they need to, it's like an overreaction in a sense? And what is the cause of that loss of masculinity in the first place?
Hmm.
Um, Again, when there's, I mean, when there's, when when women or when there's more rights for women, more gay rights, um, more liberalization of social norms that seem to threaten the patriarchy. This is when people feel that white males for Europe and America, they feel that they don't want to share the spaces of power with others. They want to keep it the way it was before. So the slogan that many of them use, "Make the nation great again." So on the one hand, they promise change, that the nation will be better, but they also promise to return to how things were before. And in the case of America or in Hungary, it's when you didn't have such liberalization of sexual and social norms. And then it becomes policy.
So it's almost like there's this fantasy that there was a productive masculinity at some point. Or
Yes,
was
and
there? Or was
that
there? Yeah.
the fantasy is that you didn't have anyone challenging your power. You could go to your country club and have it all white males. You didn't have people of color in your country club. You didn't have women in your country club, in your boardroom. You could harass women at work uh, or men, and nothing was done to you. You had impunity. You could have impunity.
Impunity. I think that that's the key here, right? It's this idea that you can live as you wish with no one
Yes.
to challenge your desires, right? Because these strong men always have some aspect of this sexual conquest, right?
Most of them do. Or if even if they personally don't have the ethos of sexual conquest, they often deprive women of rights,
Hmm.
making it easier for the men in their lives to treat them as objects or dominate them.
What's really interesting is you mentioned that actually a woman could potentially take over the strongman base. I think you mentioned Trump's daughter in your book briefly. Can you speak to how that could play out?
Yeah, so in this book, I only included male leaders, and the reasons for that is although there are women in the past, and I mean, of course, there have been many female tyrants in the earlier past, but there are women who were very strong rulers, like Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher, and some of them did repressive things. But um, there hasn't been a woman who's wrecked democracy. But I also wanted to focus on this configuration that includes machismo as a tool of rule, because I think it won't be around forever.
Hmm.
Meaning, machismo will always be there, but the monopoly on power of the strongman, with no women so far have been the head of authoritarian states, that will not continue. So, in the far right today in Europe and in America, there are a lot of women who are prominent. So, in the future, I believe we will see a far right state that's led by a woman, and it will be just as corrupt, just as racist. There might be more rhetoric about family care, but the families accepted will not be same-sex families. They won't be, taking their shirts off to show their muscles like Mussolini and Putin, but all the other anti-democratic tools of rule will be there. And I single out as possibility in our country, Trump has been grooming his daughter Ivanka, even putting her into world leader photos at the meeting of the G20 of world leaders in 2019. And this is just someone looking from outside our universe would be shaking their head of how was Ivanka Trump allowed into the world leader photo, and at the very center. None of the other world leaders, even of democracies, thought it was not a good idea to have her there. So that's a pretty clear example, and it wasn't the only time it happened.
Do you imagine that that had something to do with the fact that they couldn't imagine telling a woman to not be in the photo?
No, there were other women. There were actual real women leaders in the
Sure.
photo. No, I haven't. It's appeasement. I haven't the slightest notion why she was allowed to be in that photo. Nobody else has ever done that before. It's Trump being belligerent and having his way, and it's a family that's very skilled with optics, and they've been positioning her in the public's mind as a world leader already.
Hmm.
And this is propaganda. This is how propaganda works. You suggest something. It's called a trial balloon. You throw out the trial balloon. It could be Jews should be in concentration camps. It could be, fossil fuels should make a comeback. It could be Ivanka is a world leader. Here she is, a world leader. And then you see if you can get away with it. And if there's no pushback, then it becomes something possible.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine, or have there been any historical precedents of really strong man, strong woman type leaders where these God King figures haven't been just so destructive and have actually led nations into a more, let's say, peaceable and productive and egalitarian future?
Do you mean a benevolent dictator?
Yeah. Is that possible?
I don't think that a state where people are deprived of rights can ever be benevolent, because what nowadays in the 21st century, there's a concerted effort to make people self-censor so that police are no longer needed, so that you don't have to show the repression. You don't have to be throwing people out of helicopters because they're not doing the things to get them in those helicopters to begin with. And this is the approach of China with its social credit system, where you get points for being a subject created in the state's image. There's also, people point to Singapore as a mild authoritarian culture, but a lot of its elections are fixed. It's productive economically. But see what's happened in Hong Kong as an example of how sooner or later authoritarian states, they always become more repressive. They don't become more benevolent because the corruption needs, the control needs get greater and greater. So you think about, China could have left Hong Kong because it was a center of world commerce. It's so profitable, but it couldn't leave it because a new generation of activists came and it couldn't leave it alone, even though it is so powerful.
Can you tell more about what happened in Hong Kong?
Well, there was the umbrella revolution in 2014, but more recently, there was a reaction to some autocratic moves by the kind of head of the Hong Kong government, and this whole generation of protests started. And this was in line with this world protest that went on in 2019 that was largely interrupted by the pandemic. In Chile, there were the biggest demonstrations since the end of the dictatorship in the 1980s, right?
Wow.
And in Hong Kong, you had very determined mass protests in which business people joined in.
That's
And
unusual.
it was unusual, but it makes sense in Hong Kong because this is their very productive livelihood. And there was a huge amount of pride at this, having been able to have this degree of autonomy, and freedom brought productivity. It was a business haven. And so everybody recognized what was at stake. And then the Chinese government started to crush it, and a lot of the heads of the resistance went into exile or they're in prison.
And so now Hong Kong is completely controlled by China again?
I'm not an expert on that, so I
Sure.
can't speak to exactly what is going on like this month. But I know that many of the leaders of many activists have had to leave. So
You exclude China from your strongman analysis.
yeah, I don't look at communist countries where power is just inherited,
Mm.
because I'm interested in situations where people wreck or damage democracies
Mm.
or limited democracies. The one partial exception is Libya, where there was a conservative monarchy, but women had the right to vote. Um, and
What do you vote for in a monarchy?
They had like local elections.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
I imagine that it was just kings all the way down in a monarchy, like smaller and smaller kings. Oh, my question is about the way that democracy is kind of perceived in the world right now, where I've kind of looked at some of the data about how humans feel about democratic states, and it seems like there's this general, I don't know, mistrust, maybe? It seems like there's very little faith in the trustworthiness of democratically elected governments in the world right now. Do you find that this is the case, or do you find that that data is collected in some way that's not ideal?
No, I don't think that. I think the data is accurate, and the studies of groups of organizations like Freedom House are very well done, and they do show a greater index of uh, lack of faith in democracy. But some of this has nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with the rising disinformation and the numbers of people who are still on Facebook and other platforms where disinformation is circulated, and they're not, those tech companies are not doing enough to regulate themselves. It's a huge question, of course. And so it's inevitable that um, that messages inimical and against democracy are increasing and circulating with greater frequency.
And you
So
think that
that's
this,
part of it. That's part of it. That's not all. That's not only why, but that's part of the puzzle.
but why are, I guess the question is, why are the people that are living in these democratic governments beginning to circulate these messages? Or are the messages coming from bots or somebody else? Do you know?
In some cases, I mean, one of the biggest funders of promoters and funders of foreign disinformation is Putin's Russia, with bot factories, troll factories, misinformation that is now global through RT. There's RT America, there's RT UK, and this spreads the Kremlin talking points, which is to make people, often in very covert, subtle ways, over time, become disaffected with democracy. They also promote secessionist movements because the dream of Putin is to make democracies implode from within, like the USSR imploded, because he's never gotten over this. And so Putin funds separatists in Catalonia, in California, in Texas. He funds far-right, destabilizing far-right parties in Italy and all over the place.
And the people that are getting funded by someone like Putin, is it that they don't know that the money is coming from there, or they don't care, or do you have a sense for that?
It's case to case. It varies. Some of them know very well, and it's this kind of, we don't hear enough about the global right alliance.
Yeah.
And in America, there were these we sometimes hear about individual politicians like former Representative Steve King, who was always making himself the megaphone of European far rightists, like the Dutch Geert Wilders, and so he would, King would say, we can't have babies that are not the same race as, we can't have mixed race babies. I mean, this just, totally racist talking points, which are taken from the global right. But we haven't done, and we don't have enough investigation on, just keeping to the American example, how many Republican politicians are wedded to these far right talking points. The Trump administration elevated people like Stephen Miller, who's totally plugged into these global, and Stephen Bannon. Stephen Bannon even lived in Europe promoting far right political parties all over the continent. And yet he never lost his influence in America. And he was pardoned by, President Trump. So this is a big challenge, and we're much more interconnected. America is such a big country. It's easy to just see things in this lens, but this is a global operation to make us disaffected with democracy.
Is it possible that there's a productive form of strong political leadership? Can we imagine? I know you talk in your book about transparency and accountability. Is it possible that there could be a strong leadership that displayed those characteristics and actually just, acted like a strong man, strong woman, but advanced more productive ideals? Is there a good version of the strong man?
One which doesn't repress?
There could be, although the point of the strong man, I mean, if it's going to be or you're just saying a very strong executive presence, whether it's a male or a female, there could be someone who has even a personality cult of sorts, meaning that they are admired by millions, but any power that they exerted would have to be tempered by empathy. They would have to use that popularity and that power to a collective end. And they'd have to have humility, because authoritarianism is about arrogance. Instead of, they may be elected, but they never think that they serve the people. The people serve them. The people become just assets to be milked of their money. Natural resources have to be sucked up. And then you get to the kleptocracies, like Putin has a kleptocracy where all national resources go into, they're just wasted from thievery. So
it's like they have to be the real deal. They can't just be like these strongmen who pretend to be this person of the people and manipulate the information so they can cover up all the lies about how they're not actually a person of the people.
Yeah, so it would be a very difficult balancing act to pull off.
Do you see anyone on Earth that even seems like they could approach it?
I'm not sure who I would see. It might be a progressive woman who would be like our new vice president in America, Kamala Harris, has a lot of presence, but also a lot of empathy, and likes collaboration, because the antidote to the vertical power relations of authoritarianism, where you have the leader and the followers, is horizontal, where you have civil society bonds. And leadership is, yes, somebody has to be president and vice president, but leadership is about soliciting bonds among people for solidarity and community. Otherwise, you get situations of arrogance that we have right now. This in Texas, this disaster from the cold, and there are millions who have no power and water, and they're dying. And the senator of Texas, who's a Trump loyalist, decided to go on vacation to Cancun. He just left his people, and he didn't hide it. He flew commercial. He was in the airport lounge. He walked through the airport with his whole family. He's, in the plane, and he doesn't seem to care if people see him anymore.
I think I saw that he blamed it on his daughters, right? He was like, they wanted to go on a trip.
But this is impunity. When you, not only you don't believe you have to serve or be accountable to those who elected, you don't care anymore.
Yep.
Because you feel protected.
Well, he's been under great challenge for a long time, right? And he's survived all of those challenges. And so it can lead you to a position of feeling like, well, I can do anything.
That's exactly what happens over time. And he's also a good example, to go back to the machismo. He is truly devoted in a way that's really more of an authoritarian leader-follow relation to former President Trump. And even when Trump insulted Cruz's wife and said terrible things about her, that did not stop him that did not break the male-male bond. And so he is the perfect authoritarian subject, actually, in everything he does.
Do you ever wonder if there's a system other than democracy that might be better?
I don't think there would be. I don't see what there would. If you want a system that potentially has the well-being of all in mind, that allow government to be constituted by collective will through voting, I don't see a better system.
I guess the question that I have is that if you have a country that's split 50-50, roughly, right, which is kind of what's happening in the United States, the collective will seems to be pointed at least 50% in some frightening direction.
Yes, this is a big challenge now. And in fact, there are places on Earth that have more than two parties, and Americans used to turn their noses up at those places. Oh, how chaotic, they have so many parties, they can't get it together. But it's safer, actually, because if you only have two parties and one of them develops into an authoritarian party inside a still functioning democracy, that's a challenge.
Well, you can't really have democracy if you only have two choices, right?
Well, as long as both parties are playing inside the democratic game and they have differences of policy, that's how it used to be, you can do it.
I think what Quinn's saying is, like, if you have two people in a room and they vote, then you're never going to end up with an answer.
Especially if they're divided, right? So if you have, let's say that you don't actually have two people, let's say you have two parties, and each party votes along party lines, then...
Yes. We will see what will happen in America on Earth, because the Republican Party the history of these situations shows that the parties that support authoritarians don't do very well. They end up fragmented, they end up irrelevant. After the coup attempt of January 6th, and the majority of Republicans backed up Trump, as more comes out, and as Americans see that the Joe Biden administration is not socialist apocalypse, but indeed is competent and is going to, speed up the solution to the economic crisis we have, the health crisis. I think that some will be persuaded. But the Republican Party may fragment, may splinter. It's not clear what will happen, but it's not sustainable the way it is, unless it takes over and then you have a kind of what's called an electoral autocracy. But that would be in 2024.
An electoral autocracy is
when you have you have it's 21st century. It's like Hungary, Turkey. You have elections. You still hold elections, but they don't mean as much because look what Putin does. He poisons anybody who's a rival, like Alexei Navalny. He has to keep them off the ballot by imprisoning them or poisoning them, because you can't really have any challengers, and yet you still have elections.
Well, Dr. Ben Ghiat, we really appreciate your time. I wanted to just ask you one last question. I know you have some things you have to get back to. I ask all the humans this, and I'm curious, in your human perspective, not even necessarily your professional opinion, but what do you think the greatest threat to your species is in the next century, 10 years, near-term future?
And climate change will bring about scarcity of Earth's resources. Water should get more attention. Water is going to be one of the, grounds for struggle among elite factions, among countries, and other natural resources as well. But water will be, and there'll be out of this can come a survivalist mentality that some already have around the world. And that's not good for anybody.
We'll look out for that.
That's a sobering thought. Well, hopefully the humans can figure it out before it gets too far down that hill.
Let's hope so.
Dr. Ghiat, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.